Brian Hooker told investigators the Sea of Abaco was pitch dark when his wife, Lynette Hooker, vanished into the water. But when the Coast Guard Investigative Service intercepted their yacht, the Soulmate, they found a sophisticated infrared thermal imaging camera mounted directly on the vessel, a device designed specifically to detect human heat signatures in total darkness. For weeks, the disappearance of Lynette Hooker was classified as a tragic maritime accident. Then the timeline began to fracture. The physical evidence didn't match the forensic GPS telemetry, and the narrative of a helpless husband caught in a storm gave way to a federal homicide investigation. The question isn't just what happened in the water that night, it's what the digital footprint proves happened next. If you want every development in this case as it happens, subscribe and follow right now, because this story is still moving. On the evening of April 4th, Brian and Lynette Hooker left a dinner gathering in a small 8-foot dinghy. They were navigating back to the Soulmate, a 46-foot Morgan sailboat they had called home for the last 4 years. They were originally from the small village of Onstead, Michigan, a town with a hardware store and a blinking light, but they had sold everything to sail the world. By 4 in the morning on April 5th, Brian arrived at a marina in Marsh Harbor, Bahamas. He was alone. His official statement outlined a catastrophic cascade of equipment failures. He claimed Lynette fell overboard into choppy, high-wind waters near Elbow Key. According to his account, when she went into the water, she took the dinghy's engine keys and the safety kill switch lanyard with her. Without the kill switch lanyard, he argued, he was left powerless to restart the engine, forcing him to manually paddle the 8-foot dinghy to shore while his wife drifted away. But experienced mariners immediately noticed a structural problem with that narrative. The operational setup of that specific hard-bottom dinghy makes it highly improbable for a passenger to plunge overboard and simultaneously remove the sole means of restarting the engine, especially without the operator going into the water after them. The details of the timeline were deeply unsettling, but the evidence everyone was focused on? It wasn't the real problem. For the first 48 hours, the Royal Bahamas Police Force treated the incident as a search and rescue operation. Then, the procedural posture abruptly shifted. On April 8th, Bahamian authorities took Brian Hooker into custody. They held him for the legal maximum of 5 days for questioning. They didn't have the evidentiary threshold to charge him, so under Bahamian law, they were forced to release him. Upon his release, Brian made a public declaration. He stated he would not leave the Bahamas. He told associates it would take a higher power to force him to depart without finding Lynette. For a moment, it appeared he was committing to the recovery effort. Back in Onstead, Michigan, neighbors like Jordan Plint were watching the investigation unfold from afar. Plint, whose security cameras faced the Hooker residence, observed a distinctly volatile dynamic long before the couple set sail. Unverified reports and witness statements detailed a history of domestic tension, with claims that Lynette would periodically leave the home following violent altercations, only to be drawn back in. When federal investigators visited Plint's workplace to inquire about the relationship's history, they were actively looking into prior incidents, including uncharged allegations of domestic violence involving Brian's own children. The behavior profile was rapidly escalating from a grieving husband to a primary suspect. Why would investigators be pulling neighborhood security footage from Michigan for a maritime accident in the Bahamas? Because they were establishing a baseline of behavior, and that baseline was about to collide with Brian's actions on the island. As volunteers scoured the coastline and search planes burned fuel looking for a dry bag Lynette was allegedly carrying, Brian's demeanor was described by witnesses as unusually calm and businesslike. He wasn't inquiring about search grids, he was asking about retrieving the dinghy. His personal flotation device was recovered, but the dry bag and the green cover-up Lynette was wearing that night were nowhere to be found. The local community believed he was setting up a long-term base of operations to find his wife of over 2 decades. Until investigators checked his movements the very next morning, The higher power he claimed would be required to remove him from the island, it arrived less than 24 hours later, and it revealed exactly what he was doing while everyone else was looking for Lynette. He was at the U.S. Embassy, securing an emergency passport to board a flight out of the jurisdiction. Do you think the forensic GPS telemetry extracted from Brian Hooker's devices confirms a deliberate navigational path, or could unpredictable currents in the Sea of Abaco account for the discrepancy? If the next filing changes what we covered today, you'll want to be here for it. Brian Hooker's departure from the Bahamas left a vacuum that federal investigators rapidly filled. On June 4th, the operation was officially upgraded. The Coast Guard Investigative Service, the U.S. Coast Guard's federal law enforcement agency, alongside the FBI, assumed a dominant role, operating under the framework of a possible foreign murder of a U.S. national. Their first target wasn't the water, it was the data. Investigators executed a forensic vessel processing protocol. During a joint mission supported by the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, CGIS conducted a custody transfer of the 8-foot dinghy from Bahamian authorities to the United States for further forensic examination. But the physical boat was only half the equation. The digital footprint told a story that contradicted almost every variable of Brian's April 4th timeline. Forensic analysis of call detail records and cellular triangulation exposed massive gaps between the time Lynette allegedly went into the water and when Brian actually raised the alarm. Furthermore, Lynette's daughter Carly confirmed that Brian did not notify the family about her mother's disappearance until roughly 24 hours after the incident. But the timeline wasn't the most damaging revelation. It was the communications. Brian had publicly framed their maritime retirement as a picturesque, tight-knit voyage. The data proved otherwise. Text messages extracted from Lynette's devices, sent to a close friend and her mother Darlene, painted a volatile picture. Lynette explicitly stated that the marital strain was unbearable. She wrote, "Our marriage lasted 6 weeks cruising. It was real bad. I can't be out there with him." She was preparing to leave, and historically the most statistically dangerous time in any domestic violence dynamic is the exact moment the victim attempts to exit the relationship. Investigators also uncovered complex digital searches. It was revealed that Brian utilized Gemini AI platforms to generate maps and routing information that he subsequently sent to friends, digital assets that law enforcement now view as potential red herrings engineered to obscure his actual movements. The use of generative AI during a critical timeline window provides a profound layer of premeditation to the inquiry. When an individual engages with AI, they are effectively having an internal conversation with a digital entity, leaving behind a pristine map of their mental state, what legal scholars refer to as mens rea. The extraction of that specific query history from his devices is a devastating blow to the defense's assertion of random, unpredictable panic. The narrative of a tragic accident seemed to be holding its ground, until federal agents unlocked the location data. When Brian Hooker provided his official statement, he gave authorities a specific set of physical coordinates where he claimed the dinghy drifted helplessly after the engine failed. Search and rescue teams deployed divers, remotely operated underwater vehicles, unmanned aerial systems, and K-9 Maggie from the Broward County Sheriff's Office to thoroughly examine those grids. The Coast Guard cutter Margaret Norrell, homeported in Miami, Florida, anchored the operation. They found nothing. But when the FBI extracted the forensic GPS telemetry from Brian's own electronic devices, they didn't find the chaotic, unpredictable drift pattern of a powerless vessel caught in a storm. They found a deliberate route. The telemetry data showed the device moving to a highly specific, unsearched location in the Sea of Abaco, stopping completely for a distinct period of time and then returning. He didn't drift. And that single data point changed the entire trajectory of what happens next. Based directly on that extracted telemetry, the U.S. Coast Guard deployed back to the Bahamas for a highly targeted 4-day dive recovery mission in those newly identified areas of interest. They did not recover Lynette Hooker, but law enforcement sources confirmed that the mission brought back significant telling evidence. And while the physical search for remains continues, the forensic investigation has aggressively escalated on U.S. soil. On May 8th, federal authorities intercepted and seized the Soulmate. The vessel was initially taken to Fort Pierce, Florida, where it was surrounded by police tape and subjected to exhaustive evidence collection. It was later transferred to the Coast Guard station in Fort Lauderdale, right near Port Everglades. Seizing a private vessel requires a judge to sign a warrant. To secure that warrant, investigators must demonstrate probable cause that evidence of a crime exists on board. Weeks after the seizure, the Coast Guard Investigative Service initiated a new protocol. They contacted Lynette's father, Dan, her stepmother, Kathy, her mother, Darlene, and her daughter, Carly. They requested DNA swabs. While family reference samples are standard for body identification, legal analysts note a secondary, more forensic application. In a confined, live-aboard environment like a 46-foot Morgan, a couple's biological material is everywhere. Finding a mixed DNA profile isn't suspicious in itself. But if investigators found specific types of DNA, blood or fluid evidence in places it shouldn't mathematically be, they need familial reference samples to exclude Lynette and confirm exactly whose biological material they are looking at. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime. He has retained a federal defense attorney, replacing his original state-level attorney, Crystal Marie Hauer, with counsel experienced in dealing with the Department of Justice, and he is exercising his constitutional right not to cooperate with the Coast Guard Investigative Service. A no-body homicide prosecution is highly complex, but it is not unprecedented. To introduce prior allegations of abuse without a conviction, prosecutors must navigate complex evidentiary rules, known as Molino in New York State Court, 1101 in California, and Rule 404 in federal court. A judge must determine if uncharged prior acts are more probative than prejudicial. It is the same legal hurdles seen in high-profile proceedings involving Harvey Weinstein and Phil Spector, where the admissibility of uncharged behavior formed the battleground of the entire trial. The evidentiary foundation being built here, relying on forensic GPS telemetry, cellular data, and consciousness of guilt indicators, mirrors the structural prosecution of Scott Peterson, where circumstantial and digital timelines outweighed the initial lack of a physical crime scene. The behavioral parallels also echo the Gabby Petito investigation, where isolated locations were utilized to mask domestic volatility behind a curated facade of adventure. The financial stakes are equally severe. Lynette maintained roughly $650,000 in a 401k. Without a formal death certificate, Brian cannot access those survivor benefits. If he is formally charged, those assets are entirely frozen, fundamentally limiting his resources as he mounts a defense against the vast investigative power of the United States government. The evidence in this case isn't just what is found in the water. It is the digital exhaust left behind when someone believes they are operating in the dark, forgetting that a thermal imaging camera sees everything. If this case matters to you, the next development is one you won't want to miss. Whether the forensic vessel processing of Soulmate yielded the specific mixed DNA profile investigators were looking for, and what that profile ultimately excludes, is a question the Southern District of Florida court filings have not yet answered.